At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Reverend Dr. Joy Barnitz. And I know you know Joy from Sunday, so I don't have to do a lengthy introduction, but just a couple, on a personal level, Joy and I really got to know each other when we served as officers for Wayfarers Chapel, which is a Swedenborgian church made of glass, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, that overlooked Catalina Island on the coast of Los Angeles. And in the last couple of years, due to shifting mountains and where it was located, it had to be taken down. And the good news is they found a new location that is even better to put it back up. So we're excited about that. So Joy and I got to know each other in that capacity. And Joy is a pastor in the United Church of Christ, a longtime Swedenborgian member of our community. And this is the week, it seems, we had quantum physics, we had family and therapy last Sunday, and we're on a science kick because Joy is also a scientist, and she comes from the scientific world. And I think that's really fascinating. We're seeing this trend, not too surprising for a theology based on a Swedish scientist who had a mystical experience. And in her pastoral roles, one of the things that she's doing now, I think it's a beautiful way to combine what she's learned through her life, is she's really gifted and working with people who are passing to the next life. And one of her goals and purposes is to assure that no one passes alone. And so that's a beautiful ministry that she's engaged with now. You can read more details about her in the program, but I think that really highlights what's unique about Joy and the combination of skills that she brings. And we're looking forward to your message today.
Thank you for that introduction, Rich. And I want to welcome everybody to what I have come to know since the pandemic as sacred cyberspace, a sanctuary that has no walls, which is, in my understanding, very Swedenborgian concept, and I'm pretty sure that's something Rich shares. Because I remember early conversations with Rich back even before we were on Wayfarers that together that we were hoping we could find ways to bring people from around the world together in a spiritual community. And so, oddly enough, the pandemic showed us the way. Preparing for today's talk began in earnest when I was reflecting on Rich's sermon a couple Sundays ago on how evil works. And it was also inspired by the Walk of the Buddhist monks that recently concluded in DC. I felt a longing to know, what could I do to resist evil at work in the world? One little person, what can I do? And what work is mine to do to, as it is often put, to heal the world? And I found myself reflecting on pivot points in my journey toward ordination. It began in a more crystallized form when I was returning home to Fremont on BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System that is much like the DC Metro, and from my chaplaincy internship at an acute care hospital in downtown San Francisco. I was gazing meditatively out the window and without any real focus, felt a deep sense of knowing something. The words that came was, I was to grow where I am planted, do what only I can do, which sounded kind of arrogant in my mind at the time, and to start doing it and not to wait. And over the following few years, I engaged deeply in the local interfaith community, and I'd be happy to talk more about that afterwards. And I started to volunteer as a chaplain in the local community hospital. I joined a local church affiliated with United Church of Christ, in part because it had a great choir at the time, and during the pandemic became an active on-call chaplain at the hospital, responding to calls outside of regular working hours. Over time, it became clear to me that to do fully what I was called to do, I needed both more chaplaincy training and the support of a community of other clergy. I was fortunate to be admitted to a program where I could do clinical work at the hospital where I was already serving and develop the skills in a structured environment affiliated with one of the local theological schools. From that experience, I found myself embedded in the hospital's palliative care team and coordinating the program to support dying patients together with the sole employee in spiritual care at the hospital. And the CEO of the hospital found it very attractive as we emerged from the pandemic to prioritize getting the program started. It's amazing what the pandemic will do to change your mind about how things are supposed to work. As many of you may recall, I started attending the Church of the Holy City evening prayers during the pandemic when Zoom became an essential part of our lives, both personal and professional. And I was drawn again to Rich's concept of spiritual entrepreneurship. As I continued to do work at the hospital, I realized my ministry was more spiritual intrapreneurship, that is, initiating a new program within an established organization, although many of the challenges are common to starting any new program. And again, this is something that we might want to explore later. A pivot point, another one, was shortly after I completed seminary, when I was talking to Reese Potterveld, who was then the president of the Graduate Theological Union up in Berkeley, where the Swedenborgian House of Studies and now Center for Swedenborgian Studies is located. He asked me as the conclusion of our conversation, just as I was getting ready to walk out the door, do you attribute your resilience to being a Swedenborgian? Without even thinking, and without any hesitation, my response was absolutely, but I didn't know it until I was in my 50s. And when I said it aloud and heard it, I knew it was true. And ever since that aha moment, I've seen my life as a journey, a pilgrimage of discovering my true purpose, or as I learned to call it when I was a child in a new church school, my ruling love. And one of my favorite anthems from that childhood time comes from Psalm 16 that we read a portion of. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. And at thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Our readings today highlighted our individual paths of spiritual growth. But I want to highlight that for Swedenborgians, communal worship and prayer is essential to our spiritual growth and development. We need each other. Worship in community, gathering in prayer with others, is sharing a spiritual meal. And through sharing our reflections, our questions, our doubts, and engaging with each other, we form a community in a sacred space where our spirits are fed by the sense of belonging, which is in fact the most vital essential of foods. Each of us is on our own individual path, guided by God, and yet it's vital to our spiritual development that we gather and work with others as part of our investment in our own individual spiritual as well as material growth. In trusting communities, we develop resilience through our response to our lives in community and test our growing edges. And we may find that it is in belonging to multiple unique communities and at different times to different communities where we get essential personal growth. And of course, while there are both pleasures and treasures along our path of life, there are also times of sorrow, discouragement, even despair, and agonizing loneliness. Often it is in these darkest moments that we become aware that God is lifting us from our confusion and teaching us in the dark, showing us the path of our life. The path of life in which we form ourselves for heaven through our life in an uncertain world, fashioning each of us as a unique organic form recipient of God, as I think it's in one translation of True Christianity puts it as a description of each human, an organic form, recipient of God. A fellow clergy person calls it Jesus with skin on, which I find a useful metaphor in hospital settings. The Bible often uses the image of a road, a path, or a way as a metaphor for our lives. We find the prophet Isaiah reminding us that God says, I will lead the blind by a road they do not know, by paths they have not known. And in the New Testament, Jesus describes himself as the way, the truth, and the life in the Gospel of John. And in Matthew, we find an emphasis that we must choose to enter the gate that is narrow and the road that is hard, which is the one that leads to life. We must choose to be led by God. This choice involves attention, discipline, perseverance, practice. And it's a choice we make many times in our lives. Wherever we are on our life's journey, God is there, even when God seems to be silent. In these uncertain times of our current natural world setting, I find myself grateful for the resilience that developed during my life through overcoming setbacks such as multiple corporate restructurings, layoffs, you name it. The process of finding new positions as an employee or eventually as a consultant drew on and strengthened my ability to learn from experience, harvest and apply new insights, and develop deep connections with people, forming a circle of supportive colleagues who, I confess, pick me up when I fall short and metaphorically dust me off and help me reflect, learn, and begin again on my path. As a trained labyrinth facilitator, I often walk one of my many finger labyrinths, handheld labyrinths. And I also walk real ones in real space, outdoors and indoors. Unlike mazes, there's only one path on a labyrinth, and it's generally so narrow that it forces one to focus one's eyes on keeping to the path, paying attention to each step and to every twist and turn. The one that is being shown on the screen is an image of a medieval style labyrinth, the one that is found in the floor of Chartres Cathedral, which was laid there around 1200 Common Era, toward the end of the Crusades. Many scholars believe, and especially about this particular labyrinth at Chartres, that it was used as in place of pilgrimages to the Holy Land in the real world, in part because it had become so dangerous. And I find this metaphor of life's journey as a pilgrimage that I make by living, reflecting, recommitting to renewed understanding of my purpose. Basically, the metaphor of a pilgrimage is really helpful. I'm looking for how to form myself. Where am I being led? How do I understand my true purpose? Or, in Swedenborgian terms, my use. I was reminded in a recent worship service that each and every Christian is called to be a servant of God, to live our lives in service to each other and to the communities to which we belong. Through our participation, these communities are enriched and changed, and so are we. We are reminded in scriptures to look to God for guidance and to make the choice again and again to be led by God, often having to choose what seems to be a narrow, difficult path, one where we might find it a bit hard to trust in God's love for us. This is the marvelous freedom that God leaves us in, freedom to choose to be led or to not so choose. Our reading from Swedenborg reminds us who we really are is revealed by the paths we choose among all the ones that open up before us in our lives. We all see our own paths, spontaneously it seems, We see them because the paths there are for the loves of each individual. Love opens the paths and leads us to our kindred spirits. No one sees any paths except those of his or her love. After spending most of my adult life outside of church, yes, I was a nun, basically, no religious preference, or spiritual, not religious. I returned in my 50s, and I recall saying to lunch early in that return that I would only go to seminary if that was the only way I could do whatever it was I was called to do. And at that point, I wasn't really sure I was called to do much anything in the life of the church. And it seemed highly improbable that I would go to seminary. That conversation was several years before I ended up enrolling in seminary, and about a decade before that meeting with Reese Potterfeld. And my path to becoming a chaplain entrepreneur in a multi-faith, very diverse community setting has been very challenging and yet filled with unexpected treasures and opportunities. Today, my answer to the question of what is mine to do is to focus in on strengthening human connections where I live and serve. And as Rich mentioned, I work co-leading a No One Dies Alone program at the local hospital, and we recently trained our third cohort. We now have nearly 20 people who've been through the program and retained interest, and about 15 regular volunteers. This cohort had Muslims, Sikhs, Catholics, Buddhists, and people from religious science, which is a branch of New Thought, which has some somewhat long ties to Swedenborgian theology. This program is drawing in people who are interested in supporting this community, not just their own co-religionists. And in doing so is enriching the core of volunteers to meet the community needs in and beyond the hospital. And it's a delight to meet these people and share experiences, and at the heart to touch the fact that people are at their core good and well-intentioned, at least the people who choose to serve. And it reminds me in this troubled time that serving among other people is a way of building my connections and being reassured that, yes, people still care for one another and there is hope and a path. And some days that's really important. We've also discovered that people, even when they cannot volunteer to sit with a patient, join in sharing prayers when the person leaves the hospital, usually because they've passed on, but sometimes because they've gone to hospice. And in doing this work, I find I'm using all of my background, my experience with developing new medicines, my experience in developing a program and presenting it in corporate settings and boardrooms, and my experience in chaplaincy and in listening deeply to others and helping them find their path. So I want to leave you with a question. What are you doing to make your unique life path? What are you doing as an individual and in your communities of belonging to help to heal the world as you make that path? And most importantly, what makes you come alive? Because as Howard Thurman said, the world needs people who have come alive. The world needs you making your unique way in this life. I want to end with a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr that gives me perspective and courage when I'm somewhat depressed. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. And no virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. Amen.
Well, thank you very much, Joy. I really appreciated that, and I'm going to open it up for any questions. We love questions. And as people are thinking about it, I just want to comment on a couple of things that you said and that jumped out at me, and I really appreciated. Which you said that you kind of presented life as like a labyrinth, and we have all of our different paths we can go, and that our life is really the accumulation of the choice of paths. I thought that was really profound, and also you talked about the fact that we can't do it alone. And I remember when I was starting the church, I polled some of the younger people and said, what would you like in the service? And they said, if you could just cut out like the invocation, the confession, and the prayers, and the music, and maybe the scripture, I would find it much more, I would be more engaged. And it would be better if you recorded it so I could listen to it when I want to listen to it. And I said, well, that's a TED Talk. And they said, exactly, yeah. If you just did church like a TED Talk, I would be much more likely to, I wouldn't attend, I'd listen. So I think it's counterculture now to say, no, actually, you need to be with people, and it can be boring at times, and people can be awkward at times, and but we can't do it by ourselves. We have to be with each other. So, and that's why I appreciate you all being here today, because we need each other and to pray for each other and be with each other. So thank you for that, Joy. I want to see if there's any questions from anybody here first, and then we'll go on to.
Well, I did want to comment on one thing. I'll come up here. Hi, Joy, Christy.
Hi.
I did want to comment when you were talking about that God has you in your toughest times, and that really struck a chord with me, that this inner knowing ever since I was a child, and with all the tough times I have been through since, I always knew He was carrying me. And so when you said that, I was like, oh, that really resonated, and it took me back into my childhood. Thank you.
Anybody else here with a question? Comment? Anybody online have a question or a comment for Joy? Jose, you have your hand up.
Hi, Joy. Thanks so much for your
That's Katie.
sermon. I think that your work is really inspiring, working with people at the end of their lives, your clinical work at the hospital, working with the dying patients, and also just being on call outside of typical hours. So my first question is, what are some things that you do to take care of yourself and protect your own mental health while doing some of this really heavy spiritual work? You mentioned some things like community and supportive colleagues, but I'm just wondering if there's anything else that helps you. And then my second question is, working with so many people at the end of their life, do you notice any common patterns or experiences of people who are near death? I've read about near-death experiences, and I'm just wondering if you've personally observed anything like that, like seeing loved ones, hearing voices, that sort of thing.
Wonderful questions. I'll do my best. Start with the latter one. Many of the people that we support are actually on what we call comfort care, which means that all the interventions to keep their body working, the breathing tubes and the medicines that keep the heart beating regularly, have been withdrawn. People are often on some sort of pain reduction that keeps them from being anxious or experiencing pain from their illness. It also means that they're often not really, we call it non responsive. They can still hear you, they can feel touch. And so, one of the things we have to be very careful with is training people on how to approach a person and be with them and include them while they're there. And it's took us a while to develop a vigil process and training program that works across, because one of the things we have to do is train people know you can pray in your own spiritual language, but not allowed. So encouraging people to use sort of a tree of life metaphor to dig deeply into their own rootedness while sharing broadly what that feels like without coloring it with any particular spoken words to someone else. And that some people find that quite difficult, and others have no problem whatsoever. Can I ask you to repeat your first question? What do I do for me?
Yeah, basically, like, how do you protect yourself, like your mental health, while you're doing all this really heavy spiritual work, which I'm sure probably takes a toll?
It can. So one of the things I try to make time for every week, in addition to attending, I often come here as well as am in person at a UCC church that is, the pastor is very interested in um, climate justice and care for people who are immigrants to this country. The congregation is has Samoans, Filipinos, and Euro Americans, so it's very diverse. We use languages uh, from all three populations, which it can sometimes be difficult to get your tongue around because Tagalog and Samoan are not native to my tongue. Those are both places where I don't have to be in charge. So that, and I sing in a community choir one night a week while my spouse goes to bowling. And the other thing I do is I participate in a dance chapel that uses interplay, where I find my Swedenborgian theological training is actually extremely useful because I've never met any of these people who are regulars in real life, and we're all across the United States. Um, but I've come to know them very well over about 5.5 years. So that's one of my groundings with people who know me, and we share a love of mixing spiritual practice with sharing with movement.
Thank you so much, Joy.
Yes, Monica?
Hi, Joyce. Thank you for the service. I'm curious about your religious upbringing and also what has working with the dying taught you about living.
Two great questions. So I grew up in the Rich will have to help me here. What I have come to call the more fundamentalist Swedenborgian branch, the General Church of the New Jerusalem, which is headquartered in Bernathen. And I went to a church school in Glenview. I went to a public high school rather than going to the academy in Bernathen. And I went to a experimental college with no grades before I went to graduate school and my doctorate. And I basically walked out of regular church attendance when I left the church school. But I didn't stop thinking about my faith and insights from Swedenborg, in part because Swedenborg was a scientist and a theologian. And so for me, it was always very natural to think about all of those things together. Um, I My mother came from the convention side, which is what this church is, and so I actually have families in all three North American traditions. I have relatives of my father's who are in the Lord's New Church, so I was familiar with various views of Swedenborgianism when decided to go back to church, in part because I was tired of having people say that Christianity meant very literal interpretations of the Bible, and that didn't mesh with my understanding at all. So I found my way to the church in San Francisco. And out of that came a journey that I would never have predicted when I was a scientist practicing in corporate settings.
And the other question was, what lessons have you learned in your own living from the people who are dying? Anything in particular?
What I have learned from people is that most people value, to the extent they can communicate, it's clear they value being cared for and being um, not being in pain or struggle. And what I have come to value is the comfort that the presence of volunteers who come to sit with patients provides for the staff. And our staff are from almost every faith tradition and no faith tradition that you can imagine, and from every culture because of the diversity in this area. And what I've also learned is that is a deep sense of comfort and confidence that as I called it, sacred cyberspace is formed because the community that does vigiling is kept aware that we are holding a patient in prayer and people are visiting because we can't be there 24 hours a day. We just don't have the people to do that. But just having somebody go a couple of times a day and sit for 2 or 3 hours at a time provides a visible benefit, and the community of the volunteers is like a sacred container that helps to hold and support the family, the staff, and most importantly, the patient as they follow a path that only they know the way on. So it's taught me how common each person is in how we come to hold others and cherish them as they choose their path. And I've been in rooms with people who decide to pass when it's shift change. So one of the things I often will say very quietly is, "You don't know me. I'm here to give you comfort and support, but you feel no need to stay for me." I've been with found out from patients' families afterwards that they cherished the fact that we set up a small battery operated votive candle and a little stone heart on a napkin. Then they can take that home. A lot of people will find it's set up to as a visual sign that this person is being held in prayer. And I've set that up in rooms with Hindus, uh, every faith tradition of form of Christianity, and in Muslim, at least one Muslim family, and it's valued because it's a light that, and the candle and light and heat, which we understand as being love and understanding and wisdom, has great meaning in almost all the faith traditions here and is a comfort to the staff because they know that this person is being held. And one of the things I learned in my first chaplaincy training is the staff would call the on-call chaplain, or if they saw me, ask me to come in on my rounds, because for someone who's on comfort care, they can't really do anything except check occasionally. And people can take quite a while before their body lets them pass. And it can be very tiring for the staff. So it's a benefit to the staff to have someone come in and be with the patient because then something is being done to support the patient.
Thank you, Joy. I know that Carol put in there, "Thank you, Joy," and I want to thank you. And I will say one thing I've learned in my ministry, maybe one of the most powerful things you can do is be with someone at that moment. And so you've done that with many people. So that's a really beautiful thing that you've done in people's lives, because to be alone in that transition, that could be really frightening. And it's nice to have somebody with them. So thank you for your ministry. Thank you for your words today. And thanks for being part of this community since the pandemic. We appreciate that.